Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Baree, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about autism and secondary school. So, before I begin today's episode, I just want to relay some disclaimers, primarily in relation to trigger warnings as well as what I'm going to be talking about. So, in today's episode, I'm going to be covering my experience of being autistic in secondary school during year 9 as well as year 10. To note, the disclaimers will include the following trigger warnings as I will be talking about sensitive topics, primarily in relation to self harm, suicide, and also depression. If you are uncomfortable with these particular topics, I would suggest that you don't listen to this episode or skip to parts where you feel more comfortable. So, going into my experience of secondary school in year 9 and year 10, this is unfortunately where things get really rough, particularly as during these years I was going through quite a lot, mainly in relation to depression due to continuous bullying that I'd experienced in school. So, without further ado, I am now going to begin this particular episode. So, going into the beginning of year 9, I remember moving to a different form class. So, back in year 8, I remember wanting to move to the same form class as one of my friends, which was Mandy. And this was because at the time I remember having some previous experiences of being bullied by this one girl, Maria, and it got to a point where I just couldn't really be in the same form class anymore. So the teachers declined my request to move form classes back in year 8. However, they did accept my request in year 9, although the only issue was that the form class I was intending to move to had no spaces. So the alternative was moving to the same form class as two other girls that I befriended, which were Brandy and Mariam. So during the start of year 9, I moved to their form class, and it was actually somewhat tolerable because at least I had two girls that I were friends with at the time. So it meant that certain days were at least going to be better than others. Now, when I left my previous form class, I never really told anybody that I was leaving. I just basically left pretty much and didn't feel obligated to tell anybody because it wasn't like I had friends in my previous form class, as all of the girls that I used to be friends with at the time went to different form classes or already in different form classes. Although I think I vaguely remember one girl asking what happened to me or something, and I mentioned that I moved form classes, and I think a teacher did mention briefly that I moved form classes as well. Now, during my time in year 9, the beginning did seem okay. So, considering that I had Brandy and Mariam as friends, I mostly spent my breaks and lunches just kind of hanging around with them a lot. So, usually when we used to hang out, there were these brick stairs that we would use as like a hangout spot or something. So normally we would sit there during breaks as well as lunches. And during lunch times in particular, we would often sit there until the queues for lunch would die down. So we used to often wait for the queues in the cafeteria to decrease because there were so many students literally going into the cafeteria at once for lunch. Either that or we would mostly go to the sandwich area, which was located upstairs in the cafeteria. Although most of the time I would bring my own sandwiches, mainly because most of the school sandwiches had white bread, and by that point in my teens, I'd gone off white bread due to sort of like texture aversions to that type of food. So I would either bring my own sandwiches or I would eat crackers with cheese or something. So that was kind of okay, I guess. Sometimes as well, we used to mess around in the cafeteria toilets a lot. So we would just kind of hang out in the cafeteria toilets during lunch, sometimes until classes would start. And there were a couple of instances, I think, where we would come in late to classes. Although I think when it came to classes, we just didn't really care that much. Now, in terms of my experience of going through secondary school in year nine, the bullying that I did experience kind of got worse, and it kind of got to a point where I became depressed, and then I started to stop going to classes. Now, in terms of my attendance in school, from what I do remember, at least in year nine, it was actually decreasing during each term. So, from what I recall, due to issues concerning bullying as well as depression, my attendance in school was like 70 to 75%. And I remember my friends often telling me that a lot of students in our class would talk about it. So they used to tell me that there were girls in our form class saying that I was ruining the class attendance. So basically, if your class had a high attendance, you would get prizes or something, and people would get really upset because I was bringing the attendance down, although no one else aside from my friends really knew that I was having depression. Now, when it came to my classes as well, I remember there were two particular classes in school that I really didn't like, which were drama and ICT. So I remember with drama, I didn't like working in groups because I wasn't really good at making friends with some of the other girls. So I would often want to work on my own because it was just easier than having to socialize with people that didn't really understand me. And also, I hated performing in front of people because every time I used to perform in front of people, I would get really nervous, and my self esteem as well as my self confidence would decrease quite a lot because of it. But the one other class I often hated the most was ICT because I had this teacher who was just really nasty to students in general. And I felt like with this teacher, they weren't fully equipped in terms of understanding my needs. Now, I actually remember there was this one instance where I came in late to an ICT class, and this was because I had an appointment to see another teacher, although I misread the note because I got the times mixed up by mistake. So I came into the class, and my teacher was saying that they were talking to the class and I ruined the lesson by coming in late. And it was just really awkward because everyone was kind of staring at me that time. And I remember just going to my seat, hoping that the attention would wear off me during that time. And I actually remember my ICT teacher asking me why I was late to her lesson. And I mentioned that I had to see another teacher, but I misread their note because I mixed up the times by mistake. And my ICT teacher said, and I quote, that I was late to their lesson because I couldn't read properly. So, in other words, they were pretty much insulting my reading skill, as well as my intelligence in front of the class. And afterwards, the lesson just felt really awkward because I got to a point where it was becoming very difficult for me to even concentrate on my work because my ICT teacher insulted me. So, when I was doing my work, I remember asking one of my peers what to do because my ICT teacher didn't help me, and I was also too scared to even ask them for help in case they made me feel stupid. So, the assistant teacher that was in this class during the time mentioned that I was talking and that I wasn't concentrating on my work. And then my ICT teacher was saying that I came in late to their lesson and I was talking to somebody. And I mentioned to them that I was asking one of my peers for help with my work because they didn't want to help me. And then the assistant teacher was saying that I came in late and that I was talking. And I mentioned to them that the teacher, as in the ICT teacher, didn't want to help me. So after the lesson ended, I remember during lunchtime, I think, I texted my mum to say that I did not want to go into that lesson because I had problems with that teacher and I didn't feel uncomfortable. So every time I had ICT, I would be put into a room where I would mostly do my work by myself. And it was the Senko at the time that would allow me to work in that room. Although most of the time I didn't really do my ICT work, I was mostly watching YouTube videos to do with fighting games and things like that because I really didn't care about ICT. And because I wasn't planning on doing it for my GCSEs, it didn't really matter to me anyway. Now, I remember explaining to my mum everything that was going on, and she was the main person who recommended for me to be pulled out of ICT. And I did say to her as well that I did not want to be in the same room as that teacher because I felt uncomfortable. Now, I do remember an instance where my mum did speak to my ICT teacher during parents' evening because teachers kept forcing me into going to ICT. So I remember it was my year leader as well as the assistant teacher at the time and the Senko trying to force me into ICT, and I would refuse to go because I did not want to be in the same room as that teacher. And during parents' evening, my mum did actually meet my ICT teacher, and I remember at the time my ICT teacher mispronounced my name in front of myself and my mum, pretty much deliberately, and they said they had no records on me because I didn't attend their lessons. And it was true, I didn't attend their lessons because after they insulted me in front of my class, I stopped attending their lessons because I wasn't going to allow somebody to disrespect me in a classroom. So my ICT teacher was pretty much ridiculing me in front of my mum, and it got to a point where my mum was just really angry and threatened to basically deck the teacher outside if they weren't pregnant. And I think I remember as well that my mum received a letter from the school saying she was banned from coming to the school because she threatened a teacher, although the same teacher disrespected me. And oddly enough, I wasn't the only student that had problems with this teacher. A couple of my friends had issues with the exact same teacher as well. But then again, my school did not really care because they were more concerned about their reputation and Ofsted results. Now, when it came to ICT, I remember my teacher went on maternity leave and there was a temporary teacher that replaced them. And under that temporary teacher, I felt like I actually did a lot better when it came to my coursework, particularly because this teacher understood my needs and understood that I needed a level of support. Now, in terms of other classes I stopped attending, I remember drama as well. I stopped attending that because I never really liked drama, so every time it was a Wednesday and drama came up, I remember pretending to be sick because I just did not want to be in that lesson, as again, I absolutely hated going into drama. Now, in terms of my attendance as well, which I mentioned pretty much decreased, every time I used to go to school, I remember saying that I was ill, and I would often go to the medical room and lay in the medical room for quite some time until my dad picked me up. Because actually, I wasn't really sick most of the time. I was depressed because of bullying and also because of teachers having a go at me. And I also remember as well, some of the friendships that I used to have kind of deteriorated. So I actually remember this particular incident that took place where my friend Mariam at the time was accidentally hit with a rounder's bat by Alice, who was a girl that I was friends with as well. And Alice was autistic, so she was high functioning like myself. And I actually remember this whole situation escalated into a verbal dispute. And it got to a point where I was pretty much torn between two friendship groups. And I actually vaguely remember one of my friends at the time, Elise, mentioning that I had apparently called them a porn star or something, and another of my friends, Nina, mentioned that I should kill myself, and that this was because I sided with Mariam at the time. And it was just kind of sad, knowing that this simple accident escalated into something as bad as this. And I remember my year leader mentioning that Mariam was a bad influence on me because she was kind of sort of trying to get me on her side a lot. And looking back, she was kind of right. And even though I hated my year leader, they kind of had a point there. But of course, I didn't really realize at the time, mainly because I was sort of, a naive teenager in a way, trying to make friends with people and things like that. But I do remember another incident in relation to this where Alice was walking to the brick stairs and I was hanging around with Brandy and Mariam, and we were sort of like laughing at her. And I was kind of joining in just to fit in. And I did feel bad because I used to be bullied in school. And considering the type of person I am, I really hate it when people pick on vulnerable people, if that makes sense. So, when I see vulnerable people being treated poorly, I don't really like it. I just feel really sorry for those people. Now, when it came to my classes as well, eventually there were a couple of instances where I actually stopped attending not only drama and ICT in year nine, but all of my classes, again, mainly because of depression. So most of the time, I would sort of sit in this room with a teacher and just do work. And then if my friends tried to get me to come to lunch or whatever, I would just refuse to come because I was too depressed. Either that or I would often sit in the library reading books. So I remember when I was depressed, I'd often use my lunch breaks to go to the library and read books. And Jacqueline Wilson books were the ones that I mainly used to read. So there was this one particular book called Cookie, which was about a bullied girl who was ridiculed for being fat. And I don't know, I could kind of relate to that book, not in terms of being fat or anything like that, but also in terms of being bullied in school. Now, I also remember there were instances where people would sort of ask me really offensive questions. Like, people used to ask me all the time in year nine why I was so quiet, if my parents were loud. And whenever I mentioned my autism, I remember getting a lot of questions like, are you disabled, or being made fun of it? And I remember these year 10 girls making fun of me before for being autistic to the point where I was reduced to tears, and Mariam took me to the year leader who couldn't really do anything about the situation because they mentioned that unless I got the names of the girls, they couldn't really do anything. And it was like, what was the point, you know? And because I was going through some really awful experiences with bullying, I remember trying to convince my parents to let me move schools because I remember wanting to move to the same school as one of my closest friends who went to my primary school. But the main problem at the time was that this would sort of mess up my GCSEs. And my mum's concern, I think, was the fact that if I'd moved schools, then I would have had to catch up with GCSEs because, of course, I was coming close to GCSEs, and my mum wanted them to sort of go smoothly for me just so I could at least pass as many exams and get the grades that I needed in order to finish secondary school. And I guess I could kind of understand that. But then at the same time, it was like I just wanted to leave the school. I just didn't want to be in a place where I felt ridiculed all the time and I didn't feel supported. And now, when I look back at my experience of secondary school, especially during year 9 and parts of year 10, I feel like whenever I went home, I was safe because nobody was going to judge me or anything like that. But then in school, I didn't feel safe. So that was kind of why I tried to get out. And I guess I was lucky knowing that at least I had a safe space to go back to, especially because one of my friends in particular, Mariam, didn't have that. So it's like she would go through sort of similar things to me, but at the same time, it was like she wouldn't have that safe space. So I was always grateful knowing that I had supportive parents and things like that. So these were kind of my key moments of instance and certain experiences that I had in year 9 during my time at secondary school. So I'm going to be putting in a little indent for a short break, and then we'll be back with year 10, which is going to go into self harm and suicide, which, as mentioned before, are trigger warnings. So until then, I will see you after the break. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. So now, after the break, I am going to be delving into my experience of being an autistic student in secondary school during year 10. So before I begin talking about these particular experiences, I'd like you to grab a seat and brace yourself, because I'm going to be starting this part by reading a letter that was written on the 3rd of December of 2013. Although I am doing my GCSEs, I feel really unhappy in school because of all the problems I've had since year 7, and I feel like the teachers don't care. I was feeling depressed today, and although I tried explaining to my English teacher what happened, she said that I was going to get a behaviour point and a detention for not doing my work. I also ended up locking myself in the toilet because I was upset, and I ended up having one of my friends having to get me out of the toilet. When I'm in school, I'm not learning anything, and the teachers always complicate the lessons, and I feel dumb. Also, the teachers have let me down for 3 years because I used to get bullied in my school, and whenever I went to the teachers, I got yelled at for no reason. Another reason why I'm depressed is because one of my friends, Brandy, has left the school, and Mariam, my other friend, is leaving next year, and I'm lonely because I don't really have any other friends in the school, and nobody really bothers talking to me unless it's for spare equipment, because when I try to be friends with the other girls, they ditch me because I'm too quiet, and the teachers force me to socialise when I don't feel comfortable with the people I'm working with. I cannot cope in school anymore because I've tried, and I'm fed up of having to try to the point where I have suicidal thoughts. The teachers also pretend to care, and I feel let down, angry, trapped, and used by the teachers. I don't know what to do anymore because nobody understands how I feel in school except my family, friends, and kids' company who I visit if I feel down, and I am fed up of trying. I can't deal with this, and because of these problems, I first tried moving form classes in year 8, but I was denied this request, so I ended up moving in year 9. But I ended up trying to move schools, but I couldn't because of the fact that I would mess up my GCSEs. I am now considering homeschooling because I don't like my school and I can't cope anymore. So let me ask you this. When you listen to that letter, do you think that it was written by a teenager? Because aside from the hints regarding GCSEs and such, you might not. But in fact, it was written by a teenager. It was written by myself when I was 14 years old during the beginning of year 10, and it was written when I was depressed and feeling suicidal. And during this time, I'd actually attempted suicide twice. Once by trying to stab myself with a knife, the other time by swallowing some of my mum's iron pills, despite the fact that I didn't know whether I was going to die. You see, this was how the teachers made me feel when I was in school. And looking back at this letter, which I actually managed to find through my medical records, it's really astonishing, but also really sad knowing that I had written this more than 10 years ago. Now, in your teens, you're not really supposed to be having these kinds of feelings. You're supposed to be enjoying your life with your friends and worrying about trivial things. But when I was a year 10 student, the main thing I wanted to do was to either get homeschooled or to pretty much kill myself. So during year 10, I did experience moving form classes again. And this time, whilst I was with my friendship group consisting of myself, Brandy, and Mariam, I saw Mandy and Alice in this form again, and it was really awkward due to the tensions with the incident, the roundabout that happened in year 9. Now, as per mentioned in the letter, my friend Brandy at the time left the school in the beginning of the year, and from what I remember, she was having some schizophrenic episodes and was going through somewhat similar issues. And then Mariam was also going to leave the school in that same year. So it was like both of the people I considered my closest friends were leaving, and I was pretty much on my own again by the time they both left. Now, during this period, I stopped attending the majority of my classes, and I would often spend most of my time in the kids' company room, and I would often go there if I felt depressed. I also started doing therapy as well, so I remember going there on Tuesdays when I had GCSE history to do therapy. And the main reason I liked doing therapy on a Tuesday was because I wanted to get out of doing GCSE history, as it was one of my least favourite classes. Sometimes Mariam and I would attend sessions together, but it was mostly to get out of classes, which was actually kind of a good thing because we never really liked most of our classes besides GCSE art. Now, funnily enough, I do remember I had an experience where I was using Play Doh to create a clay ish looking version of myself during one of my therapy sessions. And I remember grabbing a small bit of Play Doh which represented my autism. And I said to my therapist that if I could, I would want to get rid of my autism so that I was normal because, to be completely honest, I hated being an autistic student in secondary school. I absolutely hated it because it was like there was this thing inside of me that made me feel different from everyone else. And I mainly desired a life where I could be considered normal. Now, in terms of the suicide letter that I had read, I actually remember writing that letter when I was in this room with a teacher and my friend Mariam at the time, and this was after I locked myself in the toilet after my English class. So we wrote our letters, and from what I vaguely remember, apparently some of the teachers cried because they knew that I was bottling up these feelings. And I think that was probably the only instance they ever took me seriously, but that was only because, at least to me anyway, because their reputation would go down the pan if they didn't do anything. Now, I remember going home early and my dad read the letter, and when my mum came home from work, that was probably one of the most devastating things she had to experience. Now, speaking of my mum, I did mention to her that I was recording this episode, and she did tell me she couldn't listen to it, mainly because she felt as a mum she could have done more. During that time, and even now as a 25-year-old, I don't really blame my parents for things going down the way they did because I felt that they were supportive towards me and they did the best they could. It was just there were unfortunate circumstances that didn't really help the situation. So, going back to the aftermath of the suicide letter, my mum was reading it, and I actually remember her sitting on my bed crying and telling me that she blamed herself for me being depressed. And I was crying as my dad watched us pretty much cry and hug each other. And because I had attempted to kill myself, my mum couldn't leave me in the house after school on my own. So every time school was finished, I would have to be picked up by my grandma on my mum's side, and my mum would pick me up from there when she would be on her way home from work because her concern was that she was going to come home one day and find me dead. Now, I remember as well, I did take a whole week of school due to feeling depressed, and at that time, I mostly spend most of my days just sort of sitting at home listening to YouTube videos or SoundCloud remixes. So I would mostly just be in my room, lying in bed with my phone, and I wouldn't really do much besides going to the bathroom or eating if I felt like eating. During my time in school, there were a couple of instances where I sort of starved myself because I just didn't really want to eat anything and I was too depressed to eat. And I also remember as well when I attended therapy, my therapist at one point mentioned why I didn't tell the teachers how I was feeling. And this was because at the time I couldn't really trust them because every time I had issues in school, they wouldn't really help me. They would just sort of say that I wasn't being bullied and that I was faking mental health issues like a panic attack and a fainting episode I had once when they forced me to go to ICT. So, they would just say, oh, I'm faking certain things for attention, when really I wasn't. I was trying to sort of communicate in a way where I was saying that clearly I needed help. It was just they didn't really care, and I felt like they didn't really care. Now, because I was in a situation where I wasn't really attending classes and such, I was kind of at risk of failing some of my GCSEs. And it wasn't just because I wasn't attending classes, it was also because I had inconsistent teaching. So there were instances where teachers would come and go a lot, and there were certain subjects like food tech slash catering where I would go through multiple teachers in the course of a whole year, and no one would really help in terms of teaching me properly. Now, during my time in school, when it came to my learning, I was supposed to have one to one support for GCSE maths in school because I remember being at risk of failing it. And I remember sitting in a room with the deputy head as well as my parents, and they were discussing the one to one sessions and everything. And I remember saying to my mum that I didn't want to do the sessions because they were never going to be implemented, as every time teachers said they would look into something or do something, they would never fulfill their end of the bargain, if that made sense. So when it came to these one to one sessions, they were never implemented, and the deputy head left by then. So this was around the time that I was already in the middle of doing my GCSEs, and I told my mum that nothing was implemented. Now, when it came to my mock exams, I did okay in certain lessons. So I did okay in English language, maths, RE, and art. So I was passing those mocks, but I failed the others. And in terms of parents' evening, I actually remember the only teacher that seemed to have faith in me when it came to doing well in my exams was my food tech teacher, because they knew I had potential, but I was let down by inconsistent teaching or teachers in general that just didn't know what they were doing, if that made sense. Now, in terms of getting extra support, there were a couple of instances where I needed it, but as usual, the teachers wouldn't pass on my details or my records. And when extra support was implemented for me, I vaguely remember having certain assistant teachers who would sort of be very patronizing towards me, like talking down to me as if I was a child, following me around. And I hated it because I felt stupid and I felt like I was incapable of doing things for myself. And in terms of my anxiety and depression as well, I had a habit of biting my nails pretty often. So I used to bite dead skin off my nails and things like that. And I used to also bite my nails themselves due to it, and I damaged my nails. Now, with my learning, I did start attending tuition. So I remember attending tuition, I believe it was for maths and science, because I was at risk of failing those. But the tuition didn't really help me because I was just given worksheets. And the way I am in terms of learning, I'm a visual learner. So, like now when I'm working, if there's something I don't know, I have to have like my manager or my colleague use visuals to show me how to do certain tasks, because that's what works for me is when you have physical examples. And when it came to tuition that I did outside of school, I often had tutors just sort of giving me worksheets and telling me to do them. And then the homework I would get would be the worksheet I did the previous week, which didn't really help me. And most of the time, it would take ages for a tutor to help me. And I got to a point where I eventually quit tuition because it was just not really sort of doing much. It was just hindering my learning, and I felt like I couldn't understand anything. Now, in terms of extracurriculars, I actually did start going to a poetry group near my local area. So I remember attending this one poetry group after school on Mondays, and it was to sort of help me in terms of finding more things to do relating to my interests and helping me gain some self esteem and confidence. And I really loved doing the poetry group because poetry is something I was interested in as a kid, and I actually published a couple of poems and things like that back in primary school. So it was a creative outlet that I was able to get back into. But unfortunately, I had to stop that because my GCSEs were coming underway and I couldn't really sort of balance GCSEs and the poetry group. Although I kind of wish, looking back, that I kept in touch with the people that were there because they were really great and they were really supportive to me, even though I was like the youngest person there. So I think by the end of year 10, I was sort of kind of, just gaining some of my confidence back. But it was really hard still because I was going through a lot of depression and it took a lot of therapy for me to sort of get out of my depression. Although by that point, I was pretty much diagnosed with clinical depression, which unfortunately I still have to this day. So it's like there's certain days that can be better for me, and then there's other days that might not be so great. So, yeah, that's pretty much how my depression works. So, anyway, this is kind of the end of my experience of discussing year 10, mainly in terms of discussing the key parts. So, next week on the 17th of March, I'm going to be releasing my next episode where I talk about my experience of being an autistic student in year 11. Now, as always, I want to thank you for listening to this episode and my previous episodes, and I also want to thank you for supporting me. Now, I am trying my best to sort of talk about my experiences in as more detail as possible. It is still taking some time because I'm not really used to talking for so long, and I get really nervous as well, especially because I'm not using a script and I'm just talking from my heart and just going through the motions as I speak. As always, I want to thank everyone for subscribing and for supporting me. It really means a lot because it's like there's that positive encouragement that really helps me get my voice across, if that makes sense. And I guess in terms of certain things I've been through, this podcast has kind of been a healing experience, especially because it's like I know that I won't be silenced anymore, which is a good thing because I really want to get myself and my voice across. But I also want to use this podcast, as mentioned many times, to really help people realize that if they are going through similar experiences, that they can thrive and they can come out on the other side. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to today's episode. And until the 17th of March, which is, of course, a Sunday because these episodes are always released on Sundays, I will be going for now. And I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you. Bye.